Welcome to True Crime with Jackson, hosted by yours truly, Jay Jackson. Thanks for tuning into the channel where we dive deep into some of the darkest stories in criminal history, unpacking the cases that haunt us and highlighting the human resilience that endures. Today's topic is one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. A man whose brutal crimes stretched over 2 decades, leaving an indelible scar in Washington state and beyond. His name is Gary Ridgway, but most of you probably know him by his ominous moniker, the Green River Killer. Ridgway's story is one that terrifies yet demands our attention. How does a suburban father and devoted churchgoer become one of the most prolific and cunning serial killers in U.S. history? To understand the monster, we begin with the man. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, but raised in Washington state, where most of his crimes would later take place. His childhood seemed outwardly normal, but behind closed doors, young Gary's life was shaped by darkness. His mother, reportedly overbearing and controlling, exposed him to strange and warped behaviors, while his father ranted about his disdain for sex workers. It was an atmosphere bubbling with tension, confusion, and judgment. And later, these early influences came together in a horrific cocktail of compulsions and sexual violence. Academically, Ridgway struggled. He was labeled as slow with poor grades, though perhaps the bigger red flag was his violent tendencies. At the age of 16, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy, claiming he wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. That boy survived, but in hindsight, this chilling act foreshadowed where Ridgway's path was heading. Fast forward to adulthood, Ridgway settled in the Seattle-Tacoma area, worked steadily as a painter at a truck company, and married 3 times. On the surface, he appeared ordinary, even banal. Friends and co-workers described him as polite and unassuming. Who could have anticipated the sinister double life he was leading? Ridgway's killing spree began in 1982, targeting vulnerable young women, many of whom were sex workers or runaways. These women trusted him. After all, he seemed harmless, a typical nice guy. But once he lured them into his vehicle, it was already too late. Ridgway would drive them to remote areas, often near Washington state's Green River, where he would strangle them, typically using ligatures such as ropes or their own clothing. He later admitted to intentionally avoiding blood, as he felt it was too messy, a grotesque and calculated detail showcasing how methodical he was in his approach. Once his victims were dead, Ridgway often left their bodies in clusters, discarding them near the river or secluded forest areas. These dumping grounds became his signature, a horrifying calling card of his deeds. And as the body count rose, so did public fear. By the end of 1984, more than 40 women had vanished, with many later linked to Ridgway. Investigators scrambled for leads while the media dubbed him the Green River Killer. This case consumed law enforcement. The King County Sheriff's Office formed a task force intent on stopping Ridgway, but he was slippery, always one step ahead. Frustrations mounted as leads turned cold and bodies continued to turn up. Authorities even sought help from an unusual source: Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer already in prison. Bundy shared his insights into what might motivate Ridgway and how he could be caught. But even that didn't lead to an immediate breakthrough. Ridgway wasn't just dangerous, he was cunning and adaptable. Knowing that police were closing in, he altered his pattern. Sometimes he even left fake evidence to throw investigators off his trail. What made him even harder to catch was his outward persona. Ridgway had a steady job and a stable home life. His co-workers never suspected him, his family was unaware, and he even displayed a facade of caring by attending church regularly. But like all monsters, his reign couldn't last forever. Science and persistence ultimately became the tools that unraveled his web of deceit. In the 1980s, DNA technology was still in its infancy. However, by the late 1990s, advancements allowed investigators to revisit cold cases with new methods. In 2001, detectives hit the jackpot. Semen samples retrieved from the crime scenes decades earlier were tested against Ridgway's DNA. The results were irrefutable. Ridgway was arrested on November 30, 2001, marking the end of one of the longest manhunts in American history. His neighbors were stunned. Some described the experience of watching the news as finding out Godzilla lived next door. The quiet man from suburbia was unmasked as a predator responsible for 49 confirmed murders, though Ridgway himself confessed to killing upwards of 70. The court proceedings were intense, as prosecutors debated seeking the death penalty. Ridgway avoided execution by agreeing to a plea bargain. He would cooperate with authorities to offer information about his victims in exchange for a life sentence without parole. Investigators hoped he would help them recover the remains of women who still hadn't been found, and he did provide them with crucial details, leading to the discovery of additional bodies that offered some closure to devastated families. But make no mistake, Ridgway's cooperation was motivated by self-preservation, not remorse. When asked why he killed so many women, he nonchalantly stated that he saw sex workers as easy targets and claimed his violent urges were uncontrollable. His lack of empathy, even decades later, was every bit as disturbing as his crimes. Gary Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, where he remains to this day. He occupies a tiny cell, far from the forest and rivers where he once hunted his victims. While he will never walk free, his actions have left impossible to fill voids in the lives of dozens of families. Despite the closure provided by Ridgway's capture and sentencing, his crimes still reverberate. Law enforcement agencies have since adapted their investigative techniques, implementing better technology and modern profiling methods. Society has also taken a harder look at how vulnerable populations are treated, including sex workers, a group Ridgway targeted for their isolation and perceived invisibility. As we wrap up, I think it's essential to remember the women whose lives were stolen. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. While the horrors committed by Ridgway continue to haunt us, their stories deserve to be heard, remembered, and valued. Thank you for joining me today on True Crime with Jackson. If you found this episode compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, stay safe and take care of each other.